Hi, it's Susan. I'm from Worldpeacefull, and I actually don't know what I'm going to talk about, but I'm feeling strongly to talk about something. I can feel the hype around the times we're in, and it's really interesting. There's a real polarity between those who are doing the right thing. They call it social distancing, but I actually think a more accurate word is physical distancing. I don't think we should be socially distancing at all. The very terminology concerns me a little bit because it sort of looks like we don't want you, connecting with your society. And it was funny, I saw a sign today when I was going for a walk and, it was talking about social distancing, but no gatherings. And I just sort of reflected to human rights and, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the right to organise, the right to groups, to gathering, and how this whole scenario turns all human rights upside down. And the great concern with this is that people get soothed into it because the government has said so. Critical thinking is extremely important, and critical thinking is not anti anything. Critical thinking is looking deeper into problems and being prepared to ask questions that might well be contentious. So what I'm going to practice actually doing right now is I'm going to practice creating an agora, a public agora, through this computer. And in my experience, whenever I've tried to communicate with government, I have never had straight answers. So I'm going to utilise this moment to ask questions of my government, of which I probably won't get any response, but I will always maintain until my last breath that I'm in a democracy. Even if the lived experience is that I am not being asked my opinion, I am not being included, I am being subject to the views and opinions of others, of which I can get some validation internationally, like I can research and look for sources without vested interest, but it's getting harder to identify them, particularly with private enterprise and corporations, because they have a whole host of people on their boards now. And these boards can change with mergers and acquisitions. So the whole public company, floating of companies, if you like, are not solid entities that are going to be there in 10 years' time. They're going to go through many, many boards and changes. So you're told one thing and then the next lot come in and it's another thing. Now, the problem with mergers and acquisitions, of course, is the concentration of power. And superfunds, of course, a huge slush fund of money through pensions, which may well be up in the air now that everything's collapsing globally, given this shutdown on the basis of a coronavirus. So I'm going to have a go at asking questions of my government. And by all means, if there is anyone, in government that actually wants to answer it, respecting myself as a citizen, I'd be really grateful for that. So what I typically do in my videos is I go still. And the reason I do that is I seek for clarity in the stillness so that I can ask questions from a basis of peace, really. So I'll just go still for a few moments and then I'll ask some questions. And they're going to be questions in the public interest. Now, from the little bit of knowledge I have, I'm going to ask questions. Some of them might well be sensitive, but as a citizen, I need to know because it's impacting my life. The coronavirus in the first instance has completely affected my life. It's affected my education. I've been forced online. So my first question will be is the government working on a strategy to implement online education to replace classroom education over a period of time? Are we on a trajectory of completely changing or transforming the education system? Has the government done any research into the impact on the brain in respect of young children learning online? And that is to do with neural network changes, comprehension, emotional intelligence. How does online education impact the brain of children, particularly given that they're still wiring those networks? That's an important question. My understanding is that we have in Australia at this point under 100 deaths. I think it's around, 94, 95 deaths. I don't know the exact number. It's around that. Out of a population of 24 million. Given that statistic at this point, and that we have been in shutdown for some months now, does the government consider the high lockdown, high priority risk management response to shutting down the entire country as a response to a pandemic? The second part of that question is, if we are dealing with less than 100 deaths, is that a pandemic or is that just 100 deaths? Next question would be, if it's not a pandemic, why is the shutdown still occurring, given that every single day people are losing thousands and thousands of dollars, which is putting them into a more vulnerable position? The next question is to do with the contraction of the economy by, say, 10%. Has the economic cost of the shutdown been out of proportion in retrospect, given less than 100 deaths here in Australia? Is the government gathering statistics on people who are suiciding or experiencing any form of psychological mental health as a result of COVID-19 and the shutdown, where they've been socially isolated? Given the trend towards public-private agreements where government may well attract in a private sector equity financer to engage in a partnership where a public service is being delivered on the basis of either borrowed funds, which indebts us, or with the agreement of an asset transferring to that private entity, given that public-private relationship, how does a contraction of the economy by 10%, coupled with a $1.5 trillion estimate of debt, how does that impact public assets? And I might probe for, do they get transferred to the private sector? Because what happened, and this is just me adding on a little bit, because what happened in the 2008 is, with the subprime situation, this repackaging of loans and directing them at people who couldn't pay back, which forced people to lose their homes and sent the country into a free fall, not to mention other countries. So the banking, if you like, misconduct of promoting loans to people who couldn't afford it, which created a situation of collapse. and asset transfer. Is this situation that we are confronting today placing our country into debt? If the answer is yes, it's placing our country into debt, which is clearly the answer. How does that impact our sovereignty as a country? If that debt is being financed by an overseas equity financer, how does that impact our ability to make independent decisions with such large sums of money being owed? Given that this has been a government-driven collapse, and I call it a collapse because we're often living on credit here, and we're seeing massive failures in respect of small to medium-sized enterprises particularly, and the fact that half the workforce is now on these JobKeeper payments, that says a lot about how vulnerable small to medium-sized businesses who have really been hit by this. My question is around why, during the shutdown, were the large multinationals allowed to make a lot of money and profit, who are foreign multinationals, I might add, and yet the local businesses who could have easily had one or two people come into shops, and many of them have low numbers of customers because they're small. Surely that would have been a better approach in order to ensure that the very foundation of our economic activity, which is Australian-owned, is allowed to trade, and many of those, half the workforce, were actually in those types of jobs. Wouldn't that have been an approach that could have ensured that we were not indebted to the tune of 1.5 trillion, where we're paying to keep people, employing people, but there's no activity happening? That's an indebted strategy rather than an empowered strategy. My next question would be, why did the government in its narrative not focus on building the immune system, given that the majority of the people were confronted with a mild virus that is actually not going to kill the majority of people? Why wasn't the chief medical officer focusing on building immune systems and having that high-level risk management approach directed at that bottom 10% who were the ones likely to die from an infection like this, as they would if they were exposed to influenza and other viruses? Why was not all the intense energy focused at that lower end to keep them safe as a strategy which ensured the well-being of the majority of people? My next question is now going to move into a more sensitive area, which I'm sure the government's aware I'm aware of, and that's to do with the whole digital IT smart cities push that our government has been actively involved in, coupled with many other governments around the world, particularly in the Western world. Although I would say India as well, given there's high tech there. Why has the government not initiated a referendum on the implementation of smart cities in our country, given that it's going to create massive social change or disruption, which was a narrative used over at least 12 months to 2 years, if not longer? Why is a referendum not being conducted on, do we want Australia to become a digitised smart country? And what this means is the full implementation of digitisation in the country. So everything goes online. And then have a public debate around the pros and the cons of that. as a democracy should do. Another very, very important health question is to do with the microwave radiation and the various experts coming around and signing major petitions. We're talking thousands of doctors and scientists signing major petitions indicating that the radiation or microwave radiation emitted from phones, from devices, which is all part of the IT product array, is causing damage to DNA, it's causing depression, anxiety, and also brain cancer, with the phones being held up to their heads. Now, that to me is a far greater health impact than the coronavirus. And what I would like to know is, why hasn't there been an inquiry into the health effects of ionizing radiation or microwave radiation from a thermal perspective? And taking into account any other possible health impacts in respect of these devices. Why hasn't that happened? I also have some more questions. Why do we have lobbyists able to gain direct access to ministers, and also lobbyists coming into political power? Is there not a conflict of interest in lobbyists having either access or being brought into politics to serve possible vested interests as a conflict of interest? I'd like to know about that. Why do political parties accept any donations at all, given that their donations can influence what they say and do? Just going to go still for a moment. They're complicated questions, I know, but I just feel they're so important to ask because people don't know to ask. So I want to go still for a moment. The feeling I have to say, just as probably a statement, is more that I really love my country. And I have really big concerns about the wealth of this country being transferred to other foreign entities. Also, the media being owned by certain concentrations of wealth, where individuals are very wealthy owning up a lot of media, and that then impacts how media reports, and that can distort the truth in respect of what the public actually gets to be exposed to. I'm very concerned about democracy being subverted by those who want to influence and control not only government but also resources and our wealth. How does the public get protected from the influences of power elites? How do our resources get protected in respect of public ownership? How do we ensure we don't lose our culture when other cultures are beaming in their norms and attitudes and violence? How do we ensure that we continue to advance Australia in such a way that really is reflective of what Australians actually want? That feels to me very, very important. I'm just going to go still again because I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this. I'm just experimenting with democracy right now. There may be some that feel that they have no power to say no, or maybe there's influence that's occurring because someone was compromised, or perhaps a perception that big and powerful interests are pushing to change the world, and many feel they have no power to actually deal with that. What I would like to say to people is you have to follow the truth within yourself. You have to be able to sit still and go inside and decide, is this true? Is this the future I want for my children and my children's children? Can I believe in something that's far greater than the power here on this planet? Can we imagine that there is a greater power, the knowing of which would change everything? Because we can't know the future despite those who believe the future is going to be in a certain profile. Future can actually be anything. And when you have the courage to imagine a future that's happy future, particularly for the children, a future where we're living in harmony with the earth systems, a future where we're not polluting and destroying species, we're not extracting because of this juggernaut of economics anymore, where we've set it aside and we've said, you know what, economic growth doesn't work anymore because it's actually harming the very support systems of the planet. We actually have to think differently now. We have to step out of the narratives we've all been indoctrinated into as security and abundance and actually stop. And I do think this time of shutdown in a positive light has actually been a very good thing for people to actually stop and think about what's important to them. I highly recommend that the public start to critically appraise everything that's being told to them and stop repeating it like it's a mantra, particularly terms like stay safe. We are safe. If the majority of people are not going to contract the coronavirus, well, then you're safe. If it's a minority, well, yes, they might not be safe in that their immune systems are compromised, and we have to make sure that they're healthy. But really, is that statement just creating the impression that we're not safe when we are? People are not questioning words like social distancing. Do we really want to socially distance, or are we physically distancing? And is that a proportionate response to 100 deaths? Is that the correct approach from a health perspective? Or is it zero-sum, meaning it makes no difference whether you socially distance or not? What is the truth of that matter, given there's only 100 deaths here in Australia? I'm not interested in what's going on in the rest of the world. Also, questions of biowarfare, where companies are allowed to patent viruses. I mean, how can that be permissible in our world? Given the profit incentive, given greed, given corruption that we know exists, why on earth would proprietary, intellectual property be given to patenting of an organism? How can that be ethically in any way endorsed when it can be used just as a nuclear weapon can be used as a tool to control others? Or it can be brought out whenever, let's say, we have governments who actually want to completely shut down their society and have them controlled. And we've had this in the past. What's to stop intermittent releases of a virus and shutdowns becoming a new normal, as that word is being brought out? What's to stop ruthless executives from releasing a virus in order to then bring the vaccine and make money out of it? They call it disaster capitalism. Is the government aware of disaster capitalism where they're making money out of crisis? It seems to me, from having had a market research background and trained in economics, what I've really awakened to is whenever profit is involved in any enterprise, what I'm seeing is that it doesn't actually work ultimately in the public interest. Because greed will always serve its own interest above the public interest, always. That's why we have consumer affairs, we have bodies, regulators in place to try and protect the interests of the public. Because there's always going to be someone out there who's going to not care about how their product or service or activity impacts the health and safety of the public. This is corporate crime. Makes no difference whether it's corporate, individual. Crime is crime. Crimes against humanity, where people are orchestrating crises in order to make money out of it. Is that explored in the parliamentary setting as far greater security threat than any wars overseas, which we all know today have been created through this push for either oil or gas, the oil oligarchies? There's already evidence of influence within governments, of oil interests, or ruling elite interest, where social violence is being organised in order to further those economic interests, not the public interest. So I kind of see us I think we're at a really important point right now. And it seems to me, is it going to be that we just hand our sovereignty over to the highest bidder, the one that we think we can cleave our economic or defence future to, where we're either safe, we think we're safe because we're under the auspice of some sort of military power, or whether we're under the auspice of an economic power, when ultimately both sides of that are not sustainable in truth, because militarism only escalates, well, massive pollutants for a start, because there's a lot of fallout with war. Depleted uranium is a case in point. It's been massive ecological impacts through munitions. And just the fact that civilians in various countries are being targets. You know, this has to be looked at. This is the dark side of human nature. It's not protecting, it's not creating peace, and it's not true peace. In truth, real peace is the reconciliation of both the dark and the light element within humanity, which is the shadow side of the human condition, tends to manifest, or does manifest, in violent acts. It manifests in deception. It manifests in control. It manifests in inadequacy, competition. This is competition where we have to win against all the odds. It's very ruthless. That's the shadow side, and it's inherent within every human being. So it's not an us against them. It's an aspect of us that we either support or we don't. And then there's the positive side of humanity, which is tending to look at building humanity. It's about the evolution of consciousness in humanity to see there is nothing to fear but fear itself. It is the love element of humanity that sacrifices oneself to save another. Not in a war setting, but in any other setting. It's like humans at their highest potential are the most extraordinary, selfless, loving, kind, considerate, inspiring. And this is what gives us the desire to live. It gives us the desire to really excel and shine. But when we've got the shadow side of ourselves that's shutting us down, that's minimizing us, that's disempowering us, that's harming us, that's destroying support systems on the planet, there has to at some point be a really, really visible conversation globally on how we're going to deal with aspects of the human condition that are not going to ensure our survival as a species. This is not going to create resilience. But if everybody's jumping on bandwagons for a quick profit, you're going to sink the Titanic, is what I'm saying. There's not enough ballast, and interestingly enough, depleted uranium is used as ballast in the ballast, apparently. And depleted uranium has a half-life of 4 billion years. Major Douglas Rockey, who I interviewed, well, myself and another colleague interviewed many years ago, he was an expert in munitions in the Pentagon. And he was speaking about the depleted uranium that was spread all over the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, probably Syria now. Now, this has a half-life of 4 billion years, and this was put in the nose cone of missiles and exploded in war. And what Major Douglas Rockey was coming out about was the immorality of his own government and the fact that his own soldiers, 10,000 military personnel in the US military, were exposed with depleted uranium, dying of cancer. He himself had been exposed as well. So he came out as a whistleblower. He was sacked by the Pentagon because he totally disagreed with this practice of putting radioactive waste in someone else's backyard. And this is what I'm saying. It all harks back to the microwave radiation as well. It's like public has to wake up that governments are actively engaging in practices that are harming civilians. And they're not caring about the health impacts of their activities because there's a disconnect happening here. The ambition to dominate subsumes the human impulse to save life and ensure a clean and healthy environment. So these dissenting voices, these whistleblowers, those coming out about 9/11 in the CIA, who were saying it was orchestrated from within and that the oil interests had got into government. See, we're seeing industry influences and interests coming into politics. That is not in the public interest when they're on their own trajectory of improving profitability for themselves and their friends. How do we restore a truly democratic system that serves the public? My feeling is, well, education has to be the starting point. I mean, I was a peace educator, so we do need to sensitise those in leadership positions particularly of firstly their duty in representing the public, not private sector. That our future is not actually in economic growth anymore. That's finished because of the ecological response to economic growth. So the melting of the ice caps, for example, the magnetic field changing on the planet, the loss of plankton through electromagnetic radiation, the many pollutants that are in the environment that we can't see but are very much embedding in the human body. And they may well kill us at 70 or 80. We can't continue on these trajectories that show no sense of responsibility for the health of not just human beings, but animal life, plant life, the biosphere. Now, I've talked about harmony in the past, but I'm talking about it in respect of homeostasis, which is a word used in biology, and it's to do with the natural system finding its balance. We live in a very incredible ecosphere where the planet naturally seeks to always rebalance. Its blueprint is to find balance, and often you'll see things swinging one way and then back the other way. That's the blueprint in action. Because we are separated in our way of thinking, we don't see ourselves as connected to one another other than through the Internet of Things, which is not human connection. That's just a device. The real interconnectivity is the feeling we have when we're in community. And I think the public have felt that with this social isolation. They're starting to realise how important community really is, and they miss being able to see people in shopping centres and out on the street and at work and travelling, and just how precious is human beings. Face-to-face contact. We're all being forced online. I personally don't resonate with online at all, and I can see how it's minimising my ability to learn already. And I can't always get on, and then we've got foreign companies who are setting up these platforms which are enabling, a classroom to meet, but we don't know where that data is going. So there's real issues with the online stuff. I don't feel any privacy. I keep getting cut off and my microphone won't turn on. I feel like I'm being shut down. And that, of course, is the big issue with digital. They can shut you down, they can delete your information, and they can store it. All that data can get stored underground. So they can hide things. It's like, this is not the world I envisage in the future. I envisage a world that is transparent, but transparent in the sense of there's nothing to fear. We're living ethical lives. We actually develop the values within children so they don't go and commit crimes, so they don't rape other people, because they've had great education teaching them about their own self-determination, self-reliance, how good it feels when you do good things for other people, rather than distorted thinking that's insecure, inadequate, and role modelling of violent films. We don't want a world like that. So we have to take responsibility for what we put into people's minds. The media has a lot to answer for, as does the entertainment industry. That's really served up violence as fun. It's not fun if you're the subject of it. Majority of issues in the courts are to do with domestic violence. So for women, we're the subject of that violence. We are the ones who are being violated because of unconsciousness glorifying violent acts as power when it's not. And this has been, in a sense, played out through the masculine in patriarchy, which is the male governance of planet. We need to bring the males and the females together in equal power so that natural balancing, like I said before, a homeostasis, will occur, because the male and the female are supposed to be equal. And I'm talking about equal in respect of values. We respect other people equally. Doesn't mean you're the same. It means we have complementary qualities, which is why we're different, but we're similar. We're meant to. The feminine, there's no mistake that women raise children. It's because women have the emotional intelligence in that area, and men are not respecting that. Or they're in denial of it, thinking it's a weakness. It's not. It's a strength. It actually gives you more ability to see more. This is how we ensure people are safe. So that emotional disconnect, which is being pushed and amplified through devices that do not evoke real connection, which would be face-to-face, three-dimensional. So look, there's a whole host of issues I'm raising, and I guess over time I'm going to be raising them more and more because I have real concerns about where we're going. And recognising that the real leadership is making decisions, but it's not controlling other human beings. It's the empowerment to decide or choose, which is the very basis of democracy in actual fact, as distinct from a compliance modelling which forces people to comply, and if you don't comply, you're excluded. That is not a recipe for world peace. That's a recipe for dividing people and creating a class system where those who comply are the ones who materially come out better. Those who don't comply may well starve. I do not wish to see in my future or the children's future a world of haves and have-nots. I think we need to mature and we need to expand our sense of family to include the entire human family and start to think holistically on the planet, that we are one species. And what we do to another, we do to the self. What you think about, you bring about. You see as you are, not as they are. To question the thoughts, to become silent so that we can hear this inner voice, which is the spiritual connect. We're all connected spiritually. That's the inner feeling that we have. That's the spiritual evidence that we are actually part of connectivity, but on a level that's extremely intimate. It's a little bit like the 100 monkey syndrome, where you get 100 thinking in the same way and then suddenly the whole population thinks the same way. That's how connected we are. And you can know that that's true because you would have had moments where you've been thinking about someone and they've rung you. You go, oh, I just thought of that, and there you are. That is the interconnectivity that's for real. We can't create any more these class systems which are inherently flawed in the sense that they advocate inequality exists when inequality doesn't actually exist, only powerlessness exists, and we embed that in structures of violence. Those structures might be based on education. Those structures can be systems of compliance, whereas if you don't do as you're told, you're cut off. That then reinforces that that person has no power. They then spiral downward, believing they're powerless, and violence can arise from that. So that's how a structure of compliance can actually embed greater violence. This is why conflict resolution, occupational health and safety, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights were created out of great situations of either bullying or mass conflict. These responses came out of everybody has rights, a right to shelter, a right to food, a right to gather, a right to dissent, freedom of speech. All these things arose out of fascist dictatorship in respect of the global war situation in World War I and II. These rights were developed by Eleanor Roosevelt and others. The Declaration was there to ensure a future peace. That was the vision. So these are not just disruptions or issues that we need to shut down because they're hampering the ambition of certain individuals who don't want to have to deal with the emotional fallout of their actions. Responsibility means you have the ability to respond, you can do something. And what that means is you have to sit down and say, okay, I'm implementing a system here. It's going to have an impact on human beings. And one way or another, I either acknowledge responsibility or I don't. And even if I don't, it's still going to come back to me one way or another. because no one has full control. It's not possible. We live in great diversity. So I think I've travelled a long way here, and I've done that because something within me is feeling very strongly that we need to inspire a democratic future based on values, based on wholeness, oneness, if we are to survive. I believe we will not survive if we're all divided into haves and have-nots, if we're still trying to produce economic growth even out of data, when it's pauperising the world in respect of resources being diverted to a certain industry, when really those resources need to be diverted to clean water, cleaning up pollution, homeostasis on the planet, living ecologically sustainable lives in a real sense. I often use the eco-village as an example, where we have tank water, solar panels or free energy from Tesla, where we have earth ships as the norm. You know, there has to be a point where we must accept that we cannot continue with economic growth in its present form. It's not going to work. We need another 4 planets to supply that type of drive to live like the United States. It's not possible for our planet to sustain it. So it's actually, even from a planning perspective, it's not possible. And yet we're still behaving and coordinating in ways to drive this economic future in this 4th industrial revolution based on IT. We're still in the same consciousness that's created the collapsing of our ecology. Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem from the same consciousness that created it. We have to think anew. This video is an offering to everybody to start to question our thinking, to start to critically think, to start to listen to the words that are being used, new normal, words like social distancing, words like it could come back again, the virus, without fundamentally dealing with the real problem that caused the virus in the first place. Was it coming from greed through the patenting of the virus? Has it come from the World Economic Forum, the Gates Foundation, these various other groupings, power groupings around the world? Are they involved? We need to understand how this virus was released. Was it released in a meat market? Was it released from a lab in Wuhan, China? This virus is a metamorphosis of, or if you like, an outpicturing of the actual virus of greed itself. Because the virus would not exist, in my view, if there wasn't a commercial interest. Now, if it's the commercial interests that are creating the great disruptions on our planet, that are maintaining a state of play that puts people in harm's way, ultimately, because economic collapse is harming the people. Big multinational companies who have interests in creating of crises is harming the public. Using chemicals and pollutants in the manufacture of items is harming the planet and the people. Our disconnect from our social emotional navigation means that we're not able to sense the harm that we're doing to others, so we don't care. This indifference is caused from an emotional, social disconnect. This has to be understood, because you cannot see what you cannot see. And what I've often said in videos is, when you don't know that you don't know, that's ignorance. It means you're not aware. You have no idea. You can't see it. But when you know you don't know and you go, you know what, I'm really not sure, there's a truth in that. And from that truth opens an awareness to, well, what is true? What do we know? I don't know. The fact that I know I don't know is the beginning of wisdom, not arrogance that thinks it knows it all. So this video is really not only an open agora, which is the very basis of a democratic system, but it's questioning what these phenomena are, where we're going, and how would a democratic society approach this, and are we losing our sovereignty? These are critical questions, because if we're losing it, we will be increasingly weakened and we will have no say over what impacts our lives. And that's when we create a very, very unhappy world, and I don't want that. I want to see happiness as our happy destiny being unavoidable. So I will leave you with that, and if any politicians want to get back to me on some of those questions, I'd be really grateful. If I'm wrong on anything, please do tell me, because I'm very open to the truth. I don't mind where it comes from. I'm just someone who loves humanity and feels to communicate. So with that, I send you love and I send you peace, and may the truth set us all free, the real truth. Thanks. Bye.